But welcome to the stage. I'll start closest to me. Jordan Jarrett-Bryan, broadcaster at Channel 4. You should recognise TalkSport here as well, and the founder of his own platform, which hopefully you've all seen, Blackademic too, which he's going to big up, I guarantee you.
3 times.
Yeah. Next to Jordan is, I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly, all right? I've practiced all day. Agbeze, is that right? Good. Former England netball star, of course, now broadcaster as well. Beside Amma is Jamie Hindhaugh from, is that correct?
Practice my name.
Head of BT Sport, our very own at TalkSport, Deputy Head, Laurie Palacio, and Anna Kessel, Women's Sport Editor at The Telegraph. But before we start the session, I do just want to invite some of Beacom's young people to give us some of the bullet points, some of the learnings from today's workshop. So can you welcome Holly Bacon, Nishal Shvega Patel, and Joseph Sam.
So I sat in on the shifting dial workshop, and as you can see on the screen beside us, some of the key points discussed were what leadership should look like. A question was raised, data shows that diverse workforces greatly benefit organisations. Why isn't progress going at a quicker rate? And finally, it was discussed that initiatives like the Beacom's masterclasses, 2 circles, diversity in sports, they're making a huge difference, not just to all civilian people taking part in them, also to leaders in the industry as well who are benefiting greatly from the ideas that people like us are bringing.
So I sat in on a lens talk, and we spoke about how visibility is vital. You have to see it to be about something we speak about so much in the media. And we have to be able to create pathways for individuals to progress, whether that's through the education system, through to the media. They need to be able to have those opportunities to progress, to have experience and be within sports media. We said there needs to be more investment in media, whether that's salaries, schemes, support, because diversity doesn't just come in representation of race and ethnicity, it comes in social class, it comes in different backgrounds, and it comes in representing the whole population in every manner possible. And we also highlighted the importance of both the education system and the media working together to create more diversity, because without the education system making opportunities and inviting people in to talk about the media, and without the media even taking that proactiveness to come in, talk about the media and encourage people to show young journalists and young aspiring journalists that they can be in the media regardless of race, ethnicity or background, showing that importance and making sure that they know that representation is possible.
I sat in the Owning Our Stories and Content breakout session, which I just want to say a big thank you to all the panelists that were on that session. We kind of went into the importance of creating our own platforms, which we can put out and produce our own content. And some of the platforms created by the panelists were Destiny Borders, Seasons Time, and Stoppage Time. And one of the first talking points we kind of started speaking about was diversity and what diversity kind of means to everyone. And we talked about diversity not only just kind of having a definition of the word, but it being a process which should always just be continually going forward. And one of the concepts we actually brought up was Kaizen. I just learned that today for the first time, so thanks for shedding light on that. Kaizen is the Japanese process of continual improvement, and we kind of came to the conclusion that that's what should be the full process in terms of diversity. That shouldn't just be a tick box that we've got diversity across the board, but we should actually always look to be diverse in terms of the people that are representing our platforms and kind of the thought processes and the perspectives on those things. We also talked about collaboration. Collaboration in terms of from our platforms and also working with the bigger media companies. And we also talked about how it's important to keep our identities when collaborating. So one of the panelists kind of touched on how important it was for him to not just jump out working at opportunities with some of these bigger corporations if they didn't fully align with some of the values and things that he, carried true to himself. And I think that's just very important in maintaining that across the board, just in terms of staying true to yourself and making sure that, some of these bigger corporations want to work with you as opposed to kind of imposing what they want on you. And I think that's just an important point to kind of hold on to going forward. And finally, the point that we all wanted to kind of leave with from that session was about, proactivity in the media industry and how we're not seeing enough of that in terms of big corporations coming down and kind of working with, smaller platforms. And we think that should be like something that should be pushed more and more going forward. And thank you.
Thank you very much. So, on to our wonderful panel to end the day. I'm going to come to more of your questions again, and I'll try and get more of them this time around. But wow, we've got some findings. We had some findings in terms of the research a little bit earlier on that we delved into in the opening panel. We've had some conversations off the back of it as well. Jamie, I wanted to start with you. Your reaction to just some of those ideas that people have discussed today.
I think they're fantastic. I think the one that I really zone in on is about us being an open industry, which we've talked about for a long time. But what I've learned a lot more in recent years, through getting involved with things like Rise Up, is about people might see the industry as open, but they don't understand the opportunity within the industry. So I run BT Sports, so we're a massive broadcaster. Most people who want to come and work for us either want to be in front of a camera or hold a camera. And I think there is a real opportunity here around openness. And for the record, I'm a real one for pathways. I didn't do uni. You don't need to do uni to get into our industry. And I think it's about, like Rise Up are doing, about getting into schools, but talking about the opportunities as an exciting opportunity of working within our media, making people realise that there is something there for everyone. And I think the more we do that, and what I love about Rise Up, for instance, is the fact that as an industry we've come together. So we're working with lots of other broadcasters, lots of other manufacturers, etc., physically going into schools, building studios, and getting the kids to build studios, and to understand what's involved in all of that. So I think there's a long way to go, and I think that openness element and being open for business is really important.
Laurie, I wanted to ask you about that final point around proactivity. We've done it a little bit at TalkSport in terms of reaching out to different platforms, trying to collaborate with them, but the point was made that isn't really done enough, particularly with sort of minority platforms or diverse platforms, if you like. Do you agree with it? What's your view on it?
It's interesting because we do always do a lot, and I heard a lot today the word trust being talked about, and I think we've got to be proactive, but we've also got to be proactive around trust. We've got to make sure that we maintain trust with those platforms, with those communities that you're talking about there. And I just sort of feel like, moving slightly away from the question, I guess, but I heard the word, the sentence from, I think it was Stephen Lyle, who said, we've got to hold the line. And I think that's really the big thing that I'm going to take away from today's, different sessions and the different workshops that we did today. Is that actually that's the hardest bit of all of this, is going to be the hold the line. And hold the line captures a lot of different things, from, I heard the word easy mentioned a lot as well, about bringing young people in, about that being easy. I think actually that's something you've just got to keep doing, got to hold the line on that. And then I think around the, the leadership point that I keep on hearing as well, about how do we inject, a better, more diverse leadership. I think that's something we're going to have to hold the line on as well. But yeah, those maybe didn't quite answer your question.
No.
But but I wanted to sort of just move it into that a little bit, because I think proactivity around holding the line for me is the biggest thing.
Okay, I'll move on. But thank you. Anna, in one of the sessions that I was in, lots of people were talking about visibility and intersections in particular, saying that visibility is one thing. We often talk about people that run big organisations talk about that, and they talk about diversity as sort of a catch-all phrase as well, but not necessarily intersections. It was raised, I think someone made the point about, being from Pakistan, there being so many different cultures and communities within that, and they can't speak for everyone that's from the same, British Pakistani community. But maybe there was a feeling that, for a lot of organisations, if you hire someone from a certain group, you're almost, that person is leaned on to speak for a certain community. Do we do that too much as an industry, do you think?
Yeah, all the time. We don't understand that, communities are not homogenous. So, for example, take the trans question in women's sport, right? You can look at Caitlyn Jenner. What's her view? She thinks exclusion. But then ask another trans person, they might have a completely different view. So you can't simply... And in the same way, you might say, we've brought in a woman around the decision leadership table. So, tick, job done. No. Women have all sorts of different views. That woman might not be pro inviting other women around the table. Or she might have different ideas about how to do it. Or she might just not be empowered because there's only one of her and everybody else is a guy. I think it's, for too long, in the time that I've been in the industry, so since 2004, started at the Observer, the year that it was the Invincibles, for any Arsenal fans in the audience. Thank you. Very exciting year to join the industry. It's always been about women, right? We need more women. We need more women's sport. And it's really, it's a hard pill to swallow that we've only learned in very recent years that women are not a monolith. And in women's sport particularly, which is my remit at the Telegraph, we've had to foster some really challenging conversations with the community of women's sport about what Leanne was talking about whiteness, being very pervasive in women's sport. For ages, we've been like, women's sport, so long as we've got women's sport, it's fine. Like, women's sport has this sort of purity about it. It has this moral value, and we can just worship it and support it, and everything it does is good, right? They don't roll on the floor like those dirty men's Premier League footballers. They're so fantastic. They're great role models. Well, no, that's not really true, actually. There's lots of problems in women's sport, and women's sport isn't inclusive as a space. If you look at the England women's football team, it's not inclusive. I think 3 players that aren't white. If you look at the women's cricket team, rugby team. So there's a lot more complex and nuanced conversations that we are starting to have, but it's kind of frustrating that we're only just starting to have them, and it shows what a long way we have to go.
Emma, what's your view on that? How do you think we can explore, it might be just the staff that we have, but the other people in our industry, so that the conversations are more broad, so that people aren't pigeonholed, if you like?
Yeah, I think exactly what Anna was saying in terms of you can ask one person a question and you can ask their sibling and it's a completely different answer. So everyone's lived experiences are different and they bring those to the table. I think today one of the biggest things that people have raised are we're doing things from the bottom, there's a pathway, there's a programme and things are moving on, but there's no one at the top and it takes time. But it doesn't have to take time, and I think as an athlete, if someone says to you, I'm not going to pick you unless you do A, B and C, you're wondering how you can have done A yesterday so that you can get there. And I feel like in the big bad world, in the industry, it's like, oh yeah, we're moving, we're slowly getting there. There are people out there who have experiences, who have worked in the industry or from other industries. So we talked about, or in sport, we talk about transferable skills. So it's not, I played netball, but I could probably transfer those skills into lots of different sports. And actually, leadership and all those things transfer from different levels and different industries. So why can't we bring people from different industries into the sports media arena? And then also in terms of our board level, I think being on the Commonwealth Games board, I have experienced firsthand that nothing happens unless it comes from the top, unless the executive believe in it. So it's all well and good having programmes coming in from the bottom to say we're going to make change, but change doesn't happen unless you start from the top. And so we're not saying that if you're a cis man, Caucasian man, you need to just drop your job and say, it's okay, take my job, I don't need the money, because obviously everybody wants to work. But how can we're talking about change, so rather than doing what we've always done, why are we not thinking about different ways that we can do things? So you have a board, can you bring in a consultant to the board? Can you bring in an associate? Can you bring in people to consult with the executive? So rather than people being threatened by becoming more diverse, how can we think outside the box to make those changes happen?
Jamie, just on Emma's point, sorry Jordan, I'm going to come to you. I wanted to ask Jamie just about that point, because it was raised in one of the sessions earlier that as an industry we're focusing a lot on the future and the people that could be the leaders of the future, and bringing people in from either outside the industry or at a younger age, and sort of it was pointed out that if you're past your sort of mid-30s, there isn't a focus on you. Obviously you're head of BT Sport, so I wondered what your view on that, because you spoke about Rise Up, which as a name itself sort of indicates that that's the process.
I quite like the link to mid-30s, I'll take that. I think it's a really, really, really difficult issue, and the fact that so many people are leaving the industry before they get that opportunity as well. It comes from, for me, allyship's really important. I agree with you, top down, and it's about making those opportunities available, and we do a lot of what you've said is bring in external people to help with that consultation as well. But I also think as an industry we need to be more collaborative with each other to help great people move around, rather than making it a competitive environment where people get held back. But there's no easy answer, and I'm very conscious of, I'm not middle class, I'm lower class, but a white guy sitting here who's I often challenge myself about this, because, you know, I joined the BBC at the very bottom grade, and I ended up where I am now, very luckily, but I often wonder whether it's because of the relationships I was allowed to access and the communities I was allowed to move within that has enabled that, and that doesn't sit very well with me. So there is something about creating the right communities, creating the right access, and creating a truly inclusive environment. And my mantra of BT Sport is very, very simple. I don't define the culture, because the culture is the people that work there. What I have to do is make sure those people want to inform change and make change happen. And but there's no easy answer. But we're trying to get it right. And I think as an industry, we keep having these conversations. We keep making sure we're bringing in the right expertise, but more importantly, we're supporting that expertise and staying within the industry. We can make some movement.
So, you said you don't define the culture. Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I own the culture, I don't define it, because the culture is the people that work within my environment.
Okay.
I might lead on it, but I don't own it.
Okay. Because I wanted to talk about leadership next, but I wanted to ask Jordan, it's a good way of leading into it, isn't it, Jordan? What do you think about the leadership in the sports media industry? Do they define cultures?
Well, before I answer that, I just want to just very quickly
does
mention...
anyone want to answer
I will get to it. I
won't ask any questions.
No. I will
answer whatever you want.
I will answer your question. I just think it's important to note that at a time where accountability seems to be lacking, and I'm leaning towards current proceedings with our current government, I think it's important that the work that Leon, Drew and the BComs crew in holding the industry of sports media to account every single year is acknowledged. This is a very important day in reflecting on what was said last year or the year before, have we made progress, and not telling our sad stories always, but coming up with solutions. So I just wanted to give a quick nod to BComs and to D-Word for doing this today again, once again. To your question, I think the issue of leadership is an interesting one, because I think in the last 2 or 3 years, the accusation that we don't see enough representation of black people on radio, on TV, online, I think is improved. I think you look at Sky, you look at BBC, you look at Channel 4, you look at ITV, you listen to Talk Sport, 5 Live. I think we're making waves there. What we're not seeing though is, to your question, enough black people in the leadership positions of sports media institutions in this country. That for me is the next step. I still think they need to do a lot better in terms of representation, but I think I still have this theory that I don't think a lot of white men, they're normally white men who run these companies, really understand why diversity is important. I think they're trying to be nice and think, let's get more black people in because it's the nice thing to do. I'm not sure they fully understand why it's important. And I say that because...
Do you want to take the opportunity to explain?
Well, I say that because a lot of the decisions that they make me realise that, okay, so you don't really get it. You don't really get why you're doing what you're doing. You're doing it because you think it's a nice thing to do. You might be under pressure. I think when we start getting more, and black women as well, I think in senior positions within sport, I think that's when I think we'll see real change. People that are making decisions about the sports coverage that we see. The Euro starts tomorrow, the Women's Euro starts tomorrow, and I'm really keen to see the coverage across the board at how the different outlets treat that particular competition.
Sticking with leadership, Amma, it was pointed out a little bit earlier on that the industry should go for more leadership from outside what's currently inside the industry, and it was a general point that you know, I think we need to search further, you know, far and wide, more so than what we're currently doing. And I wondered, in your experience, because obviously you were an athlete as well, what was the leadership like for you in terms of your experience before you came in the industry, and how does it compare?
I think in terms of being an athlete, the leadership was Caucasian, typically men. I play netball, and so they started to celebrate that. I think they had an all-female board at one stage, which goes the completely opposite way because we want diversity. So women should be celebrating having an all-female board. But in terms of, I guess everybody knows on the field, we saw the stats that Liam presented earlier. In the Premier League, there's 43% people of colour on the field. But that's not reflected in coaching, in management, in ownership, at board level. And it's not that these people don't have the skills, it's just the opportunity. So I think it just needs to be opened up more and, as you say, potentially look at other industries. So if we're saying that there is no talent that can sit at the top in the executive or non-executive within the sports media industry, there's people out there. There's experienced people, there's people who are in leadership positions, and I think it's interesting. I guess a lot of people have an interest in sport, or we know that sports people move into sports media quite a lot, but do those people get to answer questions in terms of what are we showing, who are we showing it to, what do they want to hear, who's going to present it, and those kind of questions I imagine potentially not.
Thank you. Laurie, it was pointed out that organisations need to sort of invest and spend more in terms of diversity and representation. I think the bottom line is quite an interesting one when it comes to diversity in broadcasting, because it is an investment, and a lot of organisations, they want to see some kind of return. It might not be financial, it might be a new audience, for example. How do you view it in terms of what an organisation should be spending on DEI? EDI? EDI.
I mean, we talk about, from an editorial point of view, making sure that we tell the right stories. And if we're going to tell the right stories to our audiences, we've got to make sure that we've got the right people who are coming up with those stories. So that investment that you're talking about has to be in people. That's the first place that I think we need to be very sort of clear on. And what are those stories that we need to tell? And being held accountable, to Jordan's point at the beginning, is really important in that as well, because we will just end up telling the same stories to this, that we think are the stories that people want to hear on the platforms that we think that they need to be, hearing them on. So that investment in journalism is vital at all levels, from an editorial point of view. From a commercial point of view, I think it's really important that we as broadcasters, are telling all those right stories, but that our commercial partners are also investing in us as commercial broadcasters. The BBC has a sort of very unique position where it can do certain things in a certain way, but us as BT Sport will be the same thing. We want to tell the right stories to make sure that we are telling inclusive and diverse stories. But if we don't have the backing from our commercial partners, that can be a challenging environment for us as well. And we'll still keep telling those stories, but it just makes it harder for us when we have to go and do those kind of budget talks with with the finance teams, why we're going to pursue a certain type of event or tournament. So I think that's a key thing for us, is looking at it editorially first of all, but then also making sure that we're bringing with us the commercial teams.
Is it the same for you, Jamie? Is there a particular budget dedicated? How do you spend the money on investing in diversity?
There is a budget now. The challenge for us always is we're a sports broadcaster, we just show sport. And then about 3 years ago, we recognised that we also have a voice and a personality. So we created something internally initially, which was called BT Sport United, which was basically around 3 pillars. It was around community, inclusion and sustainability. And we've done a huge amount of work in the community. We're based out in East London, working there, and diversity. And what we've done is invested in that, and it's about getting everyone who works in BT Sport behind all of that. But we now very much, if you watch BT Sport now, we have opinion, and we do a lot of programming under the BT Sport United banner around inclusion, diversity. We did LGBTQ month, which is a real step forward for us. So So it's about investing in recruitment, investing in the people who work for you. But we also want to actually have a voice and have an opinion, which is something we never had before, and that takes investment.
Okay. Questions very, very soon. Anna, I wanted to ask you, though, finally, about what you think the realistic aim should be over the next sort of 2, 3, 5 years, if you like, and whether we'll see a radical change or if that's realistic at all.
Radical change is realistic. We are always talking about how difficult diversity is, right? But we've heard Leon say that 40% of London is from an ethnic minority background, and the vast majority of us are based here. Look at what Laurie's done with TalkSport. TalkSport is totally unrecognisable to what it was, 5 years ago. If you told me that they would be covering women's football seriously, that you and Jordan would be having, your own shows, all these things, I wouldn't have believed you. If you told me that the Telegraph was going to launch a women's sport department and, the issues that we would cover, I don't think many people would have believed you. But somebody at the Telegraph, somebody at TalkSport made a decision to create radical change. Why did they do that? Well, Adam, I think he's here, maybe still. Part of it was watching the 2017 Cricket Women's World Cup final. Part of it was having a daughter. But part of it was also looking at the business case and going, wow, there's an opportunity here. No one else is doing this. Sponsors say they want it, right? I know we're talking about commercial pushback, but commercial sponsors also tell us that they believe in these values. They know that their customer base represents these values, and ultimately they want more women buying their products. They want more ethnic minority communities buying their product. So there is synergy there. So who's going to make the move? Who's going to be bold? Who's going to invest? And one thing that I've heard over the years, over and over again from senior leaders in the industry is, you want more women journalists, but they're not in the pipeline. When you go to the sports journalism degree courses, there's not many women there. Are they ready? Are they ready to go? Can you send me a list right now of the sports journalists who are ready to go top notch, that I could just slide effortlessly into my setup without any sort of disruption or really effort at all? So is that the solution that we're looking for as leaders? Because if it is, you're in dreamland, right? Where's the effort that you're putting in? Where is your own sense of accountability? Where's your own personal investment? If you look at Telegraph Women's Sport, every single person in that initial setup of that department, none of us on paper were doing the roles that we were brought in to do. I had never been an editor before. Vicky Hodges, my deputy, had never been a deputy editor before. Molly, Fiona, Katie, they'd never been journalists on national newspapers. Fadumo, she'd never been a women's sports social media editor before. So on paper, those senior leaders would have said this is not possible. And yet, over 3 years, we won a stack of awards. We helped the Telegraph to win Sports Newspaper of the Year every single year. We were acclaimed. We had huge buy-in from commercial sponsors, 13 major partners in the launch year. We tripled our subscriber, reader audience. It was success, success, success. Not only that, right, these are all external things. Internally, it was amazing the buy-in that we had right across the business. Emails from the tech department, emails from legal, from design, from social media, from commercial. Oh my God, this project's amazing. I'm so proud. I've got a sister, she plays rugby. I wish that I'd been able to play football. This matters to me. Every single year in the staff internal survey, the thing that was cited as the one project that employees were most proud of was Telegraph Women's Sport. So we had internal buy-in and satisfaction, right? Something that they felt proud to say, I'm part of the Telegraph because we're doing this. And we had external success. All of that happened because Adam took a risk and got buy-in from senior leaders. He took a risk to ask, right? Are you going to back me? Can you get resource? And he put the work in 18 months before it launched. So, and I'm sure Laurie's got his own story about how he's changed things at TalkSport, but ultimately, leaders, you have the potential to do it. Are you going to do it?
Okay, brilliant. Listen, I'm conscious I didn't get to enough of your questions a little bit earlier on, so I'm just going to go to the floor if possible. There are microphones. We'll start up here.
Hi, so question to Laurie. Laurie, I've been listening to TalkSport since day one, and I really enjoyed it. I remember when Stan Collymore was the only black person on the station. It's great that we got more black representation, but is there a reason why you don't have any Asian voices on TalkSport, given that Leon said that the Asian community make up the largest demographic. I've never really heard, unless I've missed it, I've never heard an Asian person on there as a guest, as a presenter. And it's quite sad that you almost miss that whole demographic because of the size of the community. I just wonder, is that in your thought process, despite the progress that you've made?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, Reshmin Chowdhury presents our game day show at 12:30 on a Saturday. It's brilliant. It's Premier League football. It's our biggest investment in our schedule. So there is certainly some progress being made. Can we do more? Always. That has got to be always how we look at things. The internal change makers within our organisation want to do more. I've got to give a nod to Shelley, who supports us and keeps us in check on that kind of question, but also to Lee Clayton, who, when he came to this company 3 years ago, and you're very kindly giving me all of the credit for the change at TalkSport, but there was a number of people who were internally wanting to be the change makers around that sort of thing. We started, first of all, with putting more women in front of the microphone, which has been addressed already as an issue. We started talking about making sure we had much better representation of black and brown faces and voices on air and in vision. And that journey that you're talking about there, making sure we've got more Asian people within our organisation influencing our programming, but also being in front of our cameras or in front of our microphones is super important to us. So that's definitely the next step on our big journey. And disability sports is another area where we can be held accountable on that. We haven't done brilliantly on that, and I think we're going to try and do a bit better on that in the few years to come.
Just on the simple question, how long is that journey? Because, a colleague there just said it's easy.
Yeah.
Like I said, Rashmi's great, but to hear other voices, it's almost tokenistic, if I'm being honest, not to be disrespectful, but when we've got a great journalist here, Roham's at the back, I don't think he's ever been on TalkSport, so when are people like him going to get a voice to come on as a guest to speak about the great he's doing at Desi Ballers?
Listen, I'll go and have a chat with Rohan afterwards and we'll see what we can do, right? Are you his agent? Are you on 10%?
Another question? Here at the front again, sorry.
So I have an analysis-based question for you, because you mentioned, Jamie, that you had a bit of a pipeline drop-off, right? So people were leaving before they got to the leadership level. So how much work have you done in analysing why that is? So why people leave, and included in that I'm looking at progression stats. Have you taken a look at how many of your people from underrepresented communities progress? How many have stagnated at the same level, and why? And then also, whether you are looking at things like ethnicity pay gap reporting, for example.
I think I can only talk from my own organisational perspective. I always personally do every leavers conversation to understand why someone is left. I'm also very hot on gender pay and ethnicity pay as well. It's something I don't understand, why people will be paid differently. So we look at that very carefully. I think, I don't quite know why, but I think the fact we've recognised there's something not right is helping. So we're looking at what programmes are, what support programmes are in place, what mentoring opportunities. The thing I talked about communities and access to communities, to try and understand why that's happening. But it's something we're going through at the moment. It's trying to understand why it's happening. We don't have a high turnover, don't get me wrong, but it's every single case is it stands out. I look at my senior management team and the representation isn't good enough. And I have to ask why that is.
So on progression, have you looked at progression in particular? It may not be that it's a retention issue, but it's more of how long do people from an underrepresented community stay at the same level versus those who are their peers who've progressed at a much faster rate?
I haven't seen the difference in duration, but what I have noticed is people's expectations around development time has shortened in recent years to what it used to be when I was young. And I haven't seen any more than that, but I just notice that it seems very hard. And the problem we have in an organisation like mine, the movement's very, very small at the top. And so every time you do make a movement, and normally I'm cutting roles, not creating them, unfortunately. But we're looking at how we do that. And the point you made around bringing in external voices, creating that community that isn't always within your organisation is really, really important.
Can I just add to that as well, actually? Because in my other job at Channel 4 News, we often had a big issue for a long time with senior roles, head of foreign, be it editor or the correspondent, deputy editor. They were all white men, and then it changed to often white women. And a lot of the black and brown members of staff and freelancers said to our editor at the time, why is it that when black people come through this newsroom, they get to a certain ceiling and then they leave? And the answer that Ben, our editor at the time, often offered was the same. It was, well, at Channel 4 News, not a lot of people move on in senior roles, so it's hard to make moves. And whilst that's true to a degree, it felt like a little bit of a cop-out, because now we're seeing there's been tangible change in the senior figures within our newsroom who are not all white men. So that says to me that it was possible 5, 10, 15 years ago. We had our first editor of Channel 4 News, program editor of Channel 4 News 6 months ago. Channel 4 News has been going for 33 years, and it's only now we've had our first program editor. Our head of foreign, we had our first one a couple of years ago. So whilst I kind of hear that and agree to some degree, I think it's a little bit of a cop-out to suggest that because there's not a lot of people moving on, that's the reason why black and brown staff can't progress. And that's why you're now seeing an explosion of people setting up their own platforms, because they got in. I think the diversity thing has been about how do we get more black people in? And that's not been solved, by the way. But now that there's more of them in, how do we keep them? That's where they're failing. And I think that's what the Talk Sports, Channel 4 News is, the ITVs, all the platforms need to work on. How do we keep our talented staff? Because they're there for 18 months and then thinking, actually, this is not for me, I'm moving on.
And I think just to add to that and the question, and I think Shelley touched on it earlier, data, I think, is the most important thing. So as a sports person, if you come to me as a coach and say you played awfully, I'll say, actually, I think I did okay. And then they'll bring the stats and the data, and that will prove whether I played okay or not. And so I think it's very easy to subjectively say, I think this or I think that, but I think data informs the conversation massively. So if you've got leakage from personnel at the top of a business, understanding why that is and then looking at trends across the course of time will then impact how you treat people when they come into the business. So I think everything needs to be more data-driven, so it's actually subjective.
I think we might have time for one more, if there's one more. No? Just opportune time to scratch your head, Tom. Anyone else? Okay. Go on, Lee. Just at the back.
Can I ask the panel about recruitment? You've talked about retention there. And I believe that BT did a lot of work in the local community in Stratford, and what you took from that in terms of, obviously that's an area where you could draw people from different backgrounds, different communities. And I know it's something we've done here in and around the South London area too. What more can we do around recruitment? Because if you look in the same space all the time, you just get the same people.
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of success, and this came down from the fact that we moved to East London, and I felt it was important we reflected the community that we were living in. So we created apprenticeship schemes which targeted the 6 boroughs that were impacted by the Olympics, because we're right in the Olympic Park, which have been really, really successful. We do projects with Newham College around takeover, so getting students in to make programmes, teaching them what happens within our industry, we have Rise Up, etc., etc. And I think the biggest challenge actually is that's all great, but when you're advertising roles, it's making sure those adverts go to the right people. So that's why we work with people like Beacons and why we work with other local organisations, because we've done a lot of work on, so we do redacted CVs, we do representative interview panels as well to make sure that when people have been interviewed, they're looking at the community they want to work within, not just the people who are going to be employing them directly. And we've looked at the language within CVs as well, because I think they can themselves be quite off-putting for what people are looking for. So we do a lot of open days, pizza evenings, etc. But the key thing is finding the organisations that are active within your local community to be able to communicate to them and have them almost as your recruiters, as your ambassadors for getting people in through the door. Work with people like Badu as well, and it's just about, because that was our biggest learning. It's great saying we're doing this in the community. You can advertise an apprenticeship scheme, that's quite straightforward. People apply for that, but just average roles going out there, they don't hit the right communities half the time, because people on LinkedIn or what have you, and it's like, actually, we need to go to places where the communities are able to disseminate that information and make people aware that this could be an opportunity for them as well. And that's my biggest learning from recruitment. It's about targeted, but also I'm a big fan of redacted CVs because I don't care what anyone says, everyone has bias. And what you should be looking at is what that person is offering. And just as a final point in this, I very rarely go for skills. For me, it's always about aptitude and attitude. And that's what's the most important thing. So it's getting the right people through the door to be able to let them express the opportunity that they can bring to us.
Super quickly, just to add to that, the issue of retaining talent within organisations will be discussed on my Black Academic platform, 26th of July. Shelley and Hayley are both on the panel. Will come and join us. You're all welcome. It's free.
Just before we end, thank you, Jordan. We'll all be there. Just before we end, if you had a message for everyone to take home from today, in particular about what we've learned, what you've learned, Jordan, you can start.
My message briefly would just be there's a lot of negativity around progression and where we are progressing. I think there's been examples throughout the day that I've seen in the breakout rooms where young people are getting into the industry. I think it's easy to be like, oh, things are all bad, and there are many things to address, and we mustn't let people off the hook. But also, let's celebrate the wins, and let's celebrate the successes that we are creating within our industries, and having the people who traditionally may have been haters, ops as the young people call them now, actually on board and trying to drag this issue of being inclusive, because sport's everybody. So let's make sure that we can keep that progression that I think we are seeing slowly on the table.
Anyone else? It's okay if you don't.
No,
Go ahead.
I would just like to clarify that I'm not saying diversity is easy, but I'm saying it's doable, right? But it's only doable if you put the work in. And you're only going to put the work in if you A, care about it, and B, are made to feel accountable. So I think it was Hayley's point in an earlier panel, I thought it was excellent what she was saying about how are the senior leaders in the organisation getting people around the table and going, hi, where's your results this fortnight or this month? Are we doing that? Are we having those conversations internally? How much do we value it? The stats right at the start of the day, I think you could see clearly that newspapers are probably the worst offender. What are our recruitment processes? Are they up to scratch? Do we, in newspapers, even care about HR? Or is it all just about, what's the latest exclusive on Ronaldo? It's a very intense environment. It's not easy. So in order to take time away from the pressure of the daily news beat, you have to invest resource. And to invest resource, you have to have the backing of leaders. And I do think that leaders affect the culture of an organisation. And it's difficult, but it's doable. And we can do it.
I've got two things. First of all, to the question about recruitment, I think you need organisational support in a company this big, right? Ultimately, Lee, myself, our teams, we're journalists, editors, leaders, and most of our time and our best things that we do are working out what the best stories and how we're going to tell those stories are. But when it comes to recruitment, we need the support of our HR teams, of our diversity teams, and everybody else who can help us make sure that we make the right choices and that we go to the right places and the right people see it. That's point one. And point two, to your what am I taking away from it? I'm just going to come back to the thing that I said at the beginning, Stephen Lau said, which is the thing that's going to hit me the most really, is about holding the line. We're in a really, really difficult moment, I think, in this country in terms of the rhetoric around, race and diversity and inclusion, and people who are trying to make changes in organisations this size. Initially, 2 years ago, when there was all of the, the Black Lives Matter movement and there was momentum, everyone was going, yeah, let's do this. This is a great idea. It's going to make sense for us. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how organisations respond 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later. And our jobs here is, as allies, but also as people who are going to be involved in this directly, is to hold the line and make sure that we're still recruiting people, we're still telling the right stories, and that we're going to still be involved in making sure that when we come back next year to BT's offices or whoever is going to be hosting this, that those stats still stack up, that it still is progress being made, even if it is glacial. I heard someone say in one of our sessions. And that, to the question that was being asked of me, that I'll be able to go, well, actually, Rohan's got a show on a Saturday, or whatever it is that we end up doing. No, don't worry, you've got a show as well. But giving out too many shows than I've got to give out, to be honest. But
okay. Did you have one?
Yeah, I've got two small ones. One was just related to, there was a conversation earlier about WAGs and them putting pictures out there, and does it have a place in sports media? And firstly, you need to look at the audience to see what they want. It might bring more viewers to sports and sports media. But essentially, there was a question in the panel on the lens in terms of where the balance lies in terms of, do the sports media educate people in terms of their futures, or is it the education sector that do that? So I think it's about how we portray things to an audience and understanding that the audience, it impacts them. So do we want to show people that actually you want to marry a sportsman and it's a sportsman because sportswomen's salary isn't enough? Or do you want to go on a celebrity show? Or do we want to teach people that hard work and dedication is what gets sports people to where they got to, and actually that can get you into places in the world and into sports media? The second question, or the second thing, was around, someone earlier mentioned around, should we have quotas? And I don't necessarily believe in quotas, but when things are tied to people's bonuses, suddenly they happen. So is that a question that we need to be asking?
Education came up a lot, sorry, I know you've got to finish, but education and the links between uni, schools and places like News UK, Channel 4, I think needs to be stronger as well. I think everyone in this room can mentor someone, can give an hour a month to go into a school to talk about our industry and what they do. I did one yesterday in Kettering, and talking to young people about not only the journalist or the broadcaster, but the many roles behind that. The young people's eyes are lit up. You can be a publicist, a social media manager, a hair, all the roles that come with sports broadcasting full stop. I think the next step for me is making the young people in schools realise there's so many jobs in this industry for them. That's not just on the mic in front of the camera. I think the synergy between places like TalkSport, Channel 4 where I work, and schools in the UK, I think we need to make a bigger effort to make sure that we're going into those schools to show them physically what our job is and that you can do it as well.
Okay. Did you have one, Jim?
I mean, for me, it's always for these things. It's about listening and making you think, isn't it? And also about looking at. I always think it's really good to remind yourself to look at the great stuff Channel 4 doing, the great stuff Sky doing, and learning from that and nicking some of the ideas as well. But I think I do agree with your point actually around celebration. I was thinking that when I was at Pride at the weekend. I'm thinking about how that had changed from 50 years ago when that was that much, and there's still a lot to fix there. But it's turned to this celebration, and that's what we want these events to turn into. You know, there's a lot of talk, but actually, when do we get to that point where we're celebrating progress?
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much to all of our panellists. Quick round of applause.